Get over here. Stop.
I know my rights. You can't pick me up out of my house at 6 o'clock in the morning and take me down to this shithole. I pay my taxes. I dot my T's and cross my I's. I pay your salary.
Officer Montana, will you walk over here, please? Here. Oh, yeah.
This second anthology scene, centered on Carly and Karina, initially presents itself as a chaotic, abrasive procedural moment. But when approached through a queer and emotionally grounded lens, it becomes a dense study of power, apprenticeship, complicity, and the fragile ways women learn to relate to one another inside institutions that reward emotional suppression while quietly relying on women's capacity for attunement, improvisation, and care. The scene opens in a state of disorientation and noise, a deliberate choice that mirrors the inner turbulence of its central women, particularly Carly, who is positioned as both authority figure and reluctant guide, and Karina, who arrives as a trainee eager to prove herself yet unsure of the moral terrain she is being asked to navigate. This imbalance immediately evokes a familiar dynamic within queer communities and women-dominated professional spaces, where mentorship often unfolds under pressure, speed, and unspoken expectations, leaving little room to articulate boundaries or personal values. Carly's brusque competence reads not merely as confidence but as armor, a performance honed by years of needing to be taken seriously in a space that likely questioned her legitimacy long before questioning her methods. Karina's initial lateness and visible nervousness are not framed as incompetence so much as vulnerability, signaling a woman who is still learning how to inhabit authority without losing herself in the process. For lesbian and queer viewers, this dynamic resonates deeply, reflecting the early stages of self-recognition in environments where belonging feels conditional and mentorship can become a lifeline, even when it is imperfect or ethically compromised. The interrogation itself, stripped of its surface provocation, functions symbolically as a test, not of the person being questioned, but of Karina's willingness to adopt the emotional posture required to survive within this system. Carly's insistence on procedure, control, and dominance over the situation is less about cruelty than about maintaining coherence in a role that demands certainty, and her irritation with Karina's hesitation reveals the fear that doubt might undermine not only effectiveness but safety. This is a familiar tension for many women, particularly queer women, who are often taught that uncertainty will be interpreted as weakness and that survival depends on projecting decisiveness, even when internal conflict is intense. Karina's discomfort, by contrast, represents the still porous boundary between personal ethics and professional performance, a boundary that has not yet calcified, and her presence forces Carly to confront the possibility that her own certainty may be more fragile than she allows herself to acknowledge. The scene's emotional core lies in the constant negotiation between these two women, in the glances, interruptions, and corrections that reveal how mentorship is rarely a clean transfer of knowledge and is more often an uneven process shaped by fear, admiration, and the desire for approval. This negotiation mirrors how queer women frequently learn relational scripts through observation and proximity, rather than explicit instruction, absorbing cues about what is permissible, what is rewarded, and what must be hidden. The film resists portraying this dynamic as either purely corrupting or purely empowering, instead allowing it to exist in a morally gray space that feels truthful to lived experience. Carly is neither villain nor savior. She is a woman who has adapted to an environment that prizes results over reflection, and her sharpness is inseparable from the exhaustion that undergirds it. Karina, meanwhile, is not an innocent foil but an active participant in her own formation, grappling with the realization that belonging may require compromise and that admiration can coexist with unease. This complexity is especially resonant for lesbian viewers who recognize how attraction, aspiration, and ethical tension often intertwine, particularly in relationships marked by power differentials. The scene also speaks to broader themes of emotional labor, highlighting how women are expected to manage not only their own reactions but also the emotional climate of the room, smoothing over disruptions and maintaining momentum even when discomfort arises. Karina's attempts to follow Carly's lead while suppressing her own instincts illustrate how women are often socialized to prioritize harmony and success over authenticity, a pattern that can lead to burnout and disconnection from one's own values. At the same time, Carly's impatience reveals the cost of long-term emotional containment, suggesting a woman who has learned to survive by narrowing her focus and minimizing empathy in contexts where empathy feels dangerous. The film's refusal to sensationalize these dynamics is crucial, as it redirects attention away from surface shock and toward the interior lives of its characters, insisting that the true stakes are emotional rather than procedural. For queer women, the scene's intensity recalls the way emotional intimacy is often displaced onto professional or high-stakes situations, allowing connection to flourish under the guise of urgency or necessity while remaining socially legible. The training framework becomes a socially acceptable container for closeness, enabling moments of alignment and shared focus that might otherwise be suspect or discouraged. This reflects a broader cultural pattern in which women's bonds are permitted only when framed as functional, productive, or corrective, rather than openly acknowledged as sources of desire, attachment, or mutual recognition. The scene quietly critiques this limitation by showing how deeply intertwined emotional connection and professional collaboration can become, and how artificial the boundary between them often is. As Karina seeks validation and Carly oscillates between instruction and frustration, the viewer is invited to consider how mentorship within queer contexts can replicate hierarchical structures even as it offers refuge, and how difficult it can be to disentangle care from control. This tension mirrors real-life dynamics in queer-chosen families and communities, where guidance and protection may come at the cost of autonomy, and where younger or less established women may feel pressure to conform to the emotional norms set by those who have already survived. Importantly, the film does not resolve these tensions neatly, instead allowing them to linger as questions about responsibility, complicity, and self-preservation. This openness honors the complexity of women's experiences and resists the urge to offer easy moral conclusions. Beyond its queer specificity, the scene speaks to women more broadly by capturing the exhaustion of constantly being evaluated, trained, and corrected, and the fear that missteps will be punished rather than understood. It reflects a world in which women are rarely granted the grace of learning publicly, and where mistakes are often framed as personal failures rather than systemic consequences. By centering the emotional negotiation between Carly and Karina, the film underscores how women's relationships with one another are often shaped by shared vulnerability as much as by competition, and how recognition can emerge even in moments of tension. The scene's conclusion does not offer clarity or relief, but it does leave behind a sense of mutual awareness, a recognition that both women are navigating constraints larger than themselves. This recognition is a form of intimacy in its own right, one that resonates deeply with lesbian and queer audiences who understand how connection often arises not from comfort but from shared endurance. Ultimately, this segment contributes to the anthology's broader project by framing crime not as spectacle but as context, a backdrop against which women's emotional lives unfold with urgency and consequence. It insists that women's stories, particularly those involving queer bonds, deserve to be read with nuance and care, and that the most meaningful transformations occur not in moments of dominance or victory, but in the quiet, uneasy process of learning who one must become in order to survive, and what one might lose along